So April is with our South Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. She is our tribal liaison, and she is in charge of building relationships with the 68 tribes that live in our region, in Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, and Louisiana. She does that in part because she is a member of the Chickasaw Nation herself. And also the Choctaw Nation? Just Chickasaw. Okay. So she's going to talk to us about something very important. Climate change is a justice issue in that it disproportionately affects certain people and certain groups more than others. We already know that climate change disproportionately affects people who are poor and vulnerable here in the US, as well as on the other side of the world. We know that climate change affects women and children more than men. We know that it affects people of color and marginalized groups. And we know that in fact affects Indigenous and Native people disproportionately. And many of the tribes who live in Oklahoma are not originally native to Oklahoma. They came to Oklahoma through forcible transportation, and they themselves have already had to adapt to an extreme change in climate when all of their traditions and all of their way of life was built on a certain climate. And now they're facing climate change again. So we're really delighted to have April be able to speak to us because she's based in our region, she understands the issues, and she lives them herself.
So as Catherine said, the title of tonight's talk is Losing Native Nations Cultural Heritage Due to Climate Change. So I first wanted to sort of break the ice and ask you all as attendees, have you visited a U.S. national park? What about a historic place, a U.S. historic place? What about a cultural site? Do you know if you have visited a cultural site? And some people sort of hesitate on that. So I wanted to sort of start with, obviously there are different designations of some of these cultural or cultural resources. There are Native heritage sites, and they're particularly important to cultural heritage for a state, and they have a status. Then we have National Register of Historic Places. And so there's all these different sort of terminology. There's national monuments, there are natural preserves, and there's different systems on determining which sites are recognized under these different systems. And so this terminology, when I'm asking you about some of these different cultural historic places or cultural resources here in the US, they have different meanings and importance. So next I want to talk about that there are actually 573 tribal federally recognized tribes in the US. And this is a map of where many of those tribes were originally located. So Catherine mentioned that here in Oklahoma that many of the tribes were relocated to Oklahoma. And the same for the Northwest Texas land area. This area where Texas Tech resides, I realize that many of our attendees are probably from other places. But I wanted to pull out a traditional land acknowledgement that Kiowas, Whitego, and the Comanches were originally located in the region where Texas Tech is, and the CASC, or the South Central CASC, recognizes these historical connections, and we acknowledge and honor and respect the diverse Indigenous peoples connected to this land. We fully recognize and support and advocate for the sovereign rights of all of the tribal nations. And it is our institutional responsibility to recognize and acknowledge the people, the culture, and the history. And that is what we call a land acknowledgement, which is often a way to recognize the tribal lands that we reside on. So as I mentioned, this is today's map of the 573 federally recognized tribes, tribal lands today. And so as you can see, or it's hard to see on this map anyways, but Northwest Texas, those three tribes I mentioned, the Kiowas and the Comanches were relocated to southwestern Oklahoma, and they reside there today. So next I wanted to sort of open up with a couple cool facts about Native nations. And so a couple that I wanted to mention is the term Native American does not usually refer to Native Hawaiians or Alaska Natives, such as the Inuit peoples. And so Native American is specific to the tribes here in the continental US. But in reality, most natives refer to themselves by tribal affiliation. And so I refer to myself as Chickasaw. I'm Chickasaw. And so I wouldn't typically refer to myself as a Native American or American Indian. I also wanted to share about the word Texas. Texas is the name of a group of Native American tribes, meaning friends or allies. And so it has, as many locations in the US have Native American reference and Native American language. And then another cool fact is that the Comanches, which we mentioned were part of the Northwest Texas, they were great horsemen and had large herds of horses, and they're quite known for that. And then a cool fact about the Kiowas, they're referred to as the coming out of people. And so there's a story that there's a trickster called Same Day turned the Kiowa people into ants. And then he made them leave their underground home through a log. Only half of the Kiowa people were able to leave because one of them became stuck in the opening. Because of this myth, Kiowa are referred to as the coming out people. And they have that cool story to share. Some key definitions to talk about before, to sort of orient everyone before I get started in some of the topic that we're going to talk about today, are these definitions. So cultural heritage is the legacy of physical artifacts and intangible attributes of a group or society that is inherited from past generations. Not all legacies of past generations are heritage. Rather, heritage is a product of selection by that society. Versus cultural resources are the resources that are tangible, intangible, spiritual, secular, natural, created, and range in age from ancient times to present. Cultural resources are valued and interpreted in accordance with societal and individual and personal worldviews and histories. And what's interesting about cultural resources is, even though I gave you this definition here, it's not defined legally. So it's a contemporary use used by federal, state, and local governments. And it's actually much broader than that. And a lot of different interpretations of cultural resources by the tribes and between the tribes. And then traditional ecological knowledge is refers to specifically to all types of knowledge about the environment derived from the experience and traditions of a particular group of people. And then another key one that that may come up today is preservation, where preservation is referred to as a deliberate act of keeping cultural and heritage from present for the future. So it's often in reference to a current condition or a reference condition. And so preserving something for future. With those definitions, I want to talk a little bit about how we value cultural heritage. So Western sort of thoughts are that values of cultural heritage are sort of categorized into these sort of types of things. The age of something, the economic value, the aesthetic, the cultural, historical, educational, and academic value of something, and the spiritual and religious values. So they categorize the value of cultural heritage into these various categories, where obviously Native nations, a little bit of context for this to set up sort of my story today is, so Native nations have sovereignty and self-determination. And when it comes to cultural heritage, the National Historic Preservation Act did not address sovereignty until much later. And so it wasn't until about 1992 that these amendments were made by American Indian tribes. And so it wasn't until 1997 that actually tribes began sort of creating their tribal historic preservation offices and creating those sort of authority and responsibilities. And in fact, in 2017, more than 170 tribes were participating in the National Historic Preservation Program, and had their own they have their own tribal historic preservation officers, or what we call TIPOs. And so this system of many of these practices that these staff operate under are based off of a Western value system. And many of those laws and policies in place are based off of those things. And so something that happened after that was what we call traditional cultural properties, or TCPs. And TCPs are where the tribes are creating these traditional cultural property designations for inclusion in the National Register for Historic Places. And so they're determining what those values are for those sites. And it's important in continuing their cultural identity. So with that sort of context, thinking about some of the things that these tribal historic preservation offices do. So they do have historical structures, or TCPs, that they protect. They're sort of bogged down with NACRA and grave protection. They also have cemetery crews and go out and clean up and protect their cemeteries. They do a lot of language preservation, and they're more focused on revitalizing many aspects of their culture and aspects that they're losing or have lost. And then there's this aspect of many tribes have access to federal properties for traditional practices and ways of life as well. So this gives you a little bit of context of what the tribal capacity and what types of things they do. So with that in mind, I wanted to talk a little bit about how the values of Native nations of cultural heritage is different. So they're looking at things like a sense of feeling or interconnections with the location, the living aspects of their tribal culture, the connections to their ancestors. It's very spiritual, many of these cultural resources. Everything has spirit in traditional and tribal contexts. So even the debris, the sticks or the stones, the ants, everything has spiritual. Many of these places were and are used for ceremony and for prayer. And when we think about these cultural values, it's much more holistic and not linear in thinking. It's a lot of other meaning, and these these places have a significance that's much broader, is what I'm trying to say. And so one aspect of that is, so when I mention that everything has spirit and spiritual connection, there's this aspect of believing that we should leave things in their place, that they, they're spiritually, that we don't dig them up and collect them or sell them, that they're meant to be where they're left in that context. Another aspect that I wanted to mention is the aspect of sharing information, and data sovereignty is another big thing that many of the tribes include in their values of cultural heritage. And so they don't openly share where these things are or why they're important, and it's not meant to be shared. An aspect of many tribal cultures is timing, that there's certain songs or certain stories that are only meant to be told at certain times, and it's not appropriate to share those things when it's not the right time, whether that's a certain season or other things that play into that. And this aspect of that, going back to the federal agencies and the laws that treat these natural and cultural resources separately. And so when you think about NEPA versus the National Historic Preservation Act, they're dealt with separately, where in tribal culture, they're not separate. They're one thing, they're the same. And so the natural world is very much a part of our cultural. And so those are some of the challenges of different perspectives of these types of things. So now I want to talk about what I came here to talk about today. So weather and climate is impacting these cultural resources. And I want to share some of the examples of how that's happening. And so here's a site, the Tumakakori National Historic Park. And they were impacted by an intense rainfall event. And there's this, significant damage to this structure after that event, and the wall collapsed. And so this is just one type of an example of how cultural resources and cultural heritage is being impacted. Another one is the Bandelier National Monument. So this is in New Mexico. And so they had a large fire that burned over many of their cultural sites. And then they had what we call a cascading or another event of a large flood that happened right after that. And so, they were hit by twice by extreme weather events and impacts. So you can see here in these images the types of impacts that these cultural sites have been impacted by. Oh, I skipped one. And then this is a picture of some cultural resources that have been, where they are propping them up and protecting them and maintaining them, that was devastated by Hurricane Sandy in 2012. And this is from one of the historic landmarks. Other impacts, so as you can see in this image here, that obviously when storms go through, we often have tree impacts, fallen trees, debris, tree limbs, headstones fall over, hail impacts, all sorts of types of impacts that happen as well from extreme weather when these events happen. Other types of impacts, cultural significant species are being harder to find in a lot of tribal jurisdictions, or they're moving out of the jurisdictions. And this is a map from the U.S. Forest Service showing some of those species that are projected to change and move further north and out of the U.S. As well. And so this is a concern as well. Phenological changes and changing the timing of the synchronicity of these types of things affects tribal timing of harvest and being able to respond and get out there and gather when needed. Timing of ceremonies and things like that are all changing. Oh, I did it again. So, you know, losing cultural heritage in these ways is much more than just a structure or a material. It's, you know, our connection to our ancestors and our spiritual connections. It's connection to those social and cultural traditions, whether that's historic or current day use of these places. It's also, for many tribes, an economic impact and a tourism impact. It's understanding how we adapted in the past and might traditionally adapt in the future. It's also a huge language impact. Many of our languages are based off of our, you know, where we lived and the things around us. There's a lot of language embedded in these cultural resources and cultural sites. And if we lose them, we're continuing to lose our languages in those ways. And then it's also a cultural landscape and a way of life for many communities. So it's a lot of different than just a material damage is what I wanted. But overall, it's really our identity. You know, it's how we were different from all the other tribes in a region. It's who we are. It's our means to connect to that identity and those practices. So what can we do about it? There's a lot of things being considered. So whether it's looking at longer term site management, or maybe it's putting in some kind of hard or soft protections for these sites, especially when there's water involved, if it's a flooding event or sea level rise, considering how we can protect them for the long term. It's including our cultural resources in our emergency management plans, whether that's disaster preparedness and those funding for cleaning up some of those sites when storms go through and debris are responding. It's, you know, they're doing a lot of monitoring, which is really cool. So creating early warning systems for flood and how long these sites are impacted by flood, how long they're impacted, and how long it's creating buffer zones. There's also a lot of building tribal capacity in these areas and having these sort of trainings and figuring out what it is we can do and what are those sort of options. And then, you know, here's another example where the Cape Hatteras National Seashore Lighthouse here was actually relocated. And so there are many options before that is considered. So I talked about the sort of leaving things in place is very important to many tribal cultures, that relocation is the last resort, is not something that they would consider lightly. What would that mean if we were to relocate cultural resources or sites is something that's a very hard decision to make. I also wanted to share a couple resources for this type of work and share. So the National Park Service does have a cultural resource climate change strategy. And they are starting to look at a lot of their cultural resources on national parks. And I'll share about some of those efforts here in a minute. But this is a great resource to check out if you're interested. So next, I wanted to share a little bit about some of the projects that we are doing and that are being looked at. So we have a working group looking at cultural resources and climate change. It's led out of the National Park Service Intermountain region. And they're in the process of hiring 2 cultural resource and climate change staff, hopefully this year. So they've been looking at vulnerability assessments for cultural heritage. And so they're creating this framework on how to do vulnerability assessments for cultural resources. And so they're asking for tribal input and review, and that's sort of where my job comes in, and sort of determining if we want to, and how these things are valued and what's vulnerable, and some of those priorities. They've also looked at many, like I mentioned this, that they've been looking at vulnerability of cultural resources on many of the national parks. And so they actually have a report that they're working on where they've done this framework and started to look at vulnerability of cultural resources on many national parks. There's another group that they're looking at the human remains exposed due to climate change. And so they've been having a lot of workshops and conversations, and they're working on a toolkit for protection versus excavation, so that relocation concept. So one of my projects is a research symposium for culturally significant plants and climate change. We were funded to do this event this year, but with COVID, we're having to sit on it, but hopefully we'll have it here in the next year or so, hopefully. But a little bit about what the goals are. The audience is tribal elders, tribal ethnobotanists and managers, tribal cultural and resource staff, and bringing them together with the Western terrestrial plant ecologist and other scientists to have a discussion about research that we can assist on some of these things. So things like data ownership, local versus regional approaches for some of these culturally significant plants, tribal involvement in the tool development, where they've been developing tools to look at vulnerability and restoration options and things like that. And discuss, what are some of the tribal adaptation options to help these species adapt, and start talking about what types of research projects we might do and work together on, whether it's a case study type of example of what is being done and what can be done, or maybe it's creating working groups to work together. And so those are the goals of my project. So at that time, hopefully I did good on time. That's all I have for you today, and I'd be more than happy to hang out and answer some questions.